In 1968, the Beatles released the most controversial song of their career, an 8-minute piece of abstract sound collage called Revolution 9. Depending on who you ask, Revolution 9 is either a brilliant avant-garde masterpiece or a boring piece of self-indulgent drivel. Jan Wenner sung its praises in the original Rolling Stone review, Robert Christgau and John Picarella called it an anti-masterpiece, but on the other hand, melody makers Alan Walsh wrote that it was noisy, boring, and meaningless, and NME's Alan Smith called it a pretentious piece of old codswallop. Revolution 9 is a piece that's been satirized by The Simpsons, twisted into paranoid fantasies by Charles Manson, and subject to myriad interpretations and analyses over the years. Even the great equalizer of time has done little to even out the consensus on this song. Poking around the web today, you can still find Beatles fans duking it out in forums and Reddit posts. It seems that there are many people who don't even consider Revolution 9 a piece of music at all, and see it as a crime, a violation against art, an act of destruction against the very idea of music itself. Decades after its release, new writers were still finding creative ways to express their opinions on the song. In 2007, Jonathan Gould described the song as a black hole that sucked up the energies of the White Album, concluding, "It is a track that neither invites nor rewards close attention." So I suppose this video should come with some apologies to Mr. Gould, because I'm about to give Revolution 9 some close attention. Personally, I've always been entranced by Revolution 9. I think it's a deeply unsettling piece of art that was carefully created by a group of visionary geniuses at the height of their powers. I think that Revolution 9 gave a unique perspective on its own political moment, and I think it's a piece that still resonates today. We'll get more into that later in the video, but none of that is actually why I'm talking about Revolution 9 right now. You see, Revolution 9 is just one infamous chapter in the story of a musical movement that completely reimagined what music could be and laid the groundwork for a whole myriad of ideas and techniques that are still in use to this very day. Let's take a closer look. It's August 1944, and the end of the Second World War is finally in sight. The French resistance has risen up in Paris, and with the help of the Allied powers, broken free from the shackles of Nazi tyranny. The war wasn't over yet, but already a new world was beginning to rise from the ashes. And one of the most interesting creative hubs of this oncoming world was a recording studio called the Studio d'Essai. Studio d'Essai was founded in 1942 by an experimental musician named Pierre Schaeffer. During Nazi occupation, the studio helped support the French resistance, and after the liberation, Studio d'Essai was responsible for some of the first radio broadcasts in Free Paris. But the most influential work done in that studio was yet to come. You see, Schaeffer had founded the Studio d'Essai as a home for research and experiments in sound recording. Schaeffer had been fascinated with recorded sound ever since he first started to work in radio in the early 30s. At that time, electrical recording was a new technology, and people were just starting to grasp its potential. Schaeffer started his experiments in that early era, but it wouldn't be until after the war that he and his contemporaries truly started to shake the musical world. As peacetime came to France, Schaeffer started to play around with recording techniques that nobody had seen before. He jury-rigged experimental equipment that let him manipulate sound in new ways. He was inspired by techniques he'd seen in film like montage and collage. He'd speed up and slow down audio to shift pitches, add filters that manipulated the sound output, and he even developed a new technique called a lock groove, which allowed a record to loop a given section forever. This kind of loop is absolutely revolutionary. It's the first step toward a tradition of looping that makes up a lot of modern music, especially electronic and hip-hop. And Schaeffer's innovations didn't stop there. He became fascinated with the idea of freeing music from the limitations of instruments, and experimented with creating music out of everyday sounds he recorded in the field. Schaeffer developed a philosophy around this new kind of music, naming it musique concrète. While the name literally translates to concrete music, there are some things that get lost in that translation. To understand what Schaeffer really meant by concrète, we need to look a bit closer at his writings. He documented his experiments in philosophy in a series of journals and essays he would later publish as À la recherche d'une musique concrète, or In Search of a Concrete Music. In that book, Schaeffer explained his vision. I have coined the term musique concrète for this commitment to compose with materials taken from given experimental sound in order to emphasize our dependence no longer on preconceived sound abstractions, but on sound fragments that exist in reality and that are considered as discrete and complete sound objects, even if, and above all when, they do not fit in with the elementary definitions of music theory. So concrète is an inversion of the way that music is made and recorded. Rather than composers beginning with abstract ideas and transforming them into a score and then a physical recording or performance, concrète begins with physical sounds that already exist in the world and then abstracts them into conceptual pieces, divorcing sound from its original source. This radical approach broke down conventional understandings of what music could be and rebuilt it for a new mechanical age. Schaeffer's theories would also posit another incredibly influential idea, the idea of creating music not to be performed live, but to be experienced exclusively through recordings and speakers. He would later develop the term acousmatic music to describe this concept. Schaeffer debuted his musique concrète to the world in 1948 with 5 études de bruit, or 5 studies of noise. The first of these, Étude au chemin de fer, might be the most famous. In it, Schaeffer assembles a series of field recordings he made at Batignolles Station with his mobile sound unit, still recording on shellac discs. This represents one of the first uses of what would one day come to be known as sampling, and it's often considered one of the very first pieces of electronic music. As fascinating a piece as it is, I'm much more drawn to Étude Violette, which uses manipulated recordings of a piano played by the avant-garde composer Pierre Boulez. Schaeffer's manipulations turn Boulez's piano into something strange, distant, and haunting. For me, it's a soundscape that seems to question the onset of this new post-industrial world. And really, that's one of the things that I love about musique concrète. It is an art form that is in direct conversation with a world that was fast changing around it. The technological and societal advancements of the early 20th century were completely transforming the ways humans interfaced with each other and the world. Mass media was on the rise, industrialization had swept its way to even the remotest pockets of the earth, and the looming threat of nuclear arms hung over the globe. In fact, Schaeffer spent years of his life outside music as an anti-nuclear activist. In a 1986 interview with Tim Hodgkinson, Schaeffer even explores the question of what sort of music a nuclearized world deserves. Science makes advances in technology and understanding, but the world of humanity doesn't change. Morally, the world is both better and worse than it was. We are worse off than the Middle Ages or the 17th and 18th centuries in that we have the atomic menace. Why should a civilization which so misuses its power have or deserve a normal music? A lot of Schaeffer's experimentations thus deal with a kind of harsh and cold music, a practice that is as much an exercise in engineering as it is in composition. And maybe unsurprisingly, a lot of these experiments were met with derision and scorn, just like the Beatles' own piece of concrète would be decades later. But there were some who understood the potential in Schaeffer's vision and experiments. One of those is the third Pierre we'll meet in our story, Pierre Henry. Henry was a generation younger than Schaeffer and had begun his own experiments with noise and found sound at just 15 years old. After studying at the Paris Conservatory in his youth, Henry joined Studio d'Essai in 1949 and began to work under the tutelage of Schaeffer. He brought a different energy into the studio, one that contrasted with Schaeffer's dry, erudite philosophizing. In the 2007 documentary The Art of Sounds, Henry himself summed up the divide. For Schaeffer, musique concrète was like a musical philosophy. For me, I immediately wanted to create works, and what's more, profitable ones. In the early years, the two were able to reconcile their differences and collaborate on some of the most seminal works of musique concrète. In 1950, they premiered their first version of Symphonie pour un homme seul, a symphony of noise to be performed live using a series of turntables and mixers. Like much of the early concrète, this symphony is a strange and unsettling piece that contemplates the modern human condition. Schaeffer described the piece in his writings. The lone man should find his symphony within himself, not only in conceiving the music in abstract, but in being his own instrument. A lone man possesses considerably more than the 12 notes of the pitched voice. He cries, he whistles, he walks, he thumps his fist, he laughs, he groans, his heart beats, his breathing accelerates, he utters words, launches calls, and other calls reply to him. Nothing echoes more a solitary cry than the clamor of crowds. Symphonie pour un homme seul is an attempt to express aspects of the human experience that cannot be captured in conventional music. It marked the beginning of a productive period of experimentation between Schaeffer, Henry, and the rest of the Studio d'Essai. A year after it debuted, Schaeffer founded a new group within French radio, Groupe de Recherche de Musique Concrète, which was explicitly targeted at advancing Schaeffer's new sort of music. The GRMC got put in a new studio and got their hands on a piece of technology that was about to change music forever: the magnetic tape recorder. The idea of recording sound on tape is about as old as any other recording technique. In the early decades of sound recording, there were a number of different experiments with tapes made of wax or celluloid film. There was even a series of recorders that used thin, magnetized steel wires, predecessors to the magnetic tape that we use today. In fact, a few years before Schaeffer founded the GRMC, an Egyptian composer named Halim El-Dab created some of the early iterations of what would soon be called concrete on these magnetic wires. All these early technologies were cumbersome, unreliable, and frequently had poor recording quality. The design that formed the basis for the modern reel-to-reel tape recorder first came about in the 1930s, but it wasn't available to most of the world for quite some time. You see, the earliest of these recorders, the magnetophone, was developed under Nazi Germany. The recording quality of the magnetophone was unlike anything that came before it. In fact, it was so crisp that some Allied analysts mistook pre-recorded broadcasts made on the magnetophone for live radio broadcasts. The Nazis kept this technology under wraps throughout World War II, and it wasn't until the late stages of the war that the Allied troops got their hands on these recorders and took them home. Some magnetophones would wind up at the BBC, while others found their way to American engineers who started to iterate on the technology. While these tape recorders were technically available to Schaeffer in his early days, they were clunky and unreliable and difficult to get your hands on. But by the early 50s, tape recording technology had become much more reliable and available. Schaeffer and Henry leapt on this new technology and quickly developed new techniques for the concrete toolkit. They experimented with tape splicing, tape looping, and backmasking, among others. These new techniques helped launch the GRMC into a fruitful period in the early 50s. Schaeffer and Henry developed their theories more, releasing a number of studies and experiments, as well as Orphée 53, the first ever musique concrète opera. One of the key theories underpinning all of these experiments was the concept of the sound object. Schaeffer described the sound object in his book. The unit of sound is the equivalent to a unit of breath or articulation, a unit of instrumental gesture. The sound object is therefore an acoustic action and intention of listening. In his mind, the sound objects that made up musique concrète should be removed from their sources and presented in such a way that the listener could come at them with no previous bias or assumption. The GRMC spent many of their days capturing and creating these kinds of sound objects, which were then cataloged and organized by Henri's wife Michelle, creating what amounted to be one of the first truly extensive sample libraries. The GRMC became a hub for experimental composers and drew the attention of some of the most radical minds of the era. Edgar Varèse was a fellow Frenchman who was fascinated with explorations of electronic music and noise. He would famously offer up a definition of music as organized sound and become an early father of electronic music. Varèse was particularly influential on Frank Zappa, who exchanged letters with him as a teenager. One of Varèse's most famous works is 1958's Poème électronique, a seminal piece of early electronic music that owes a lot to the concrète. The worlds of musique concrète and early electronic music naturally bled into each other, and that can be seen in the works of one of the most celebrated composers to walk through GRMC's doors, Karlheinz Stockhausen. Stockhausen was another avant-garde composer who would one day wear the title of the father of electronic music. In 1952, Stockhausen created his Concrète Etude, though he had quickly become disillusioned with the limitations of musique concrète. He respected the experimentation and theory behind it, but found Schaeffer's philosophy limiting. So he took aspects of concrète and mixed it with the early electronic music coming out of Germany. The result of these experiments was Gesang der Jüngling, a seminal early electronic work that would become a stated influence on the Beatles. In fact, it would actually be quite easy to jump from Stockhausen back to Revolution 9, but that would brush over some key happenings and important figures in the development of concrète and the avant-garde. By the late 50s, concrète seemed ready to break free from Schaeffer's strict philosophies, and you can understand why. While all the works we've talked about so far are daring and brilliant experiments, I'd be lying if I said I spent many evenings at home relaxing with musique concrète after a long day of work. The experiments coming out of the GRMC were deliberately harsh and incredibly unapproachable for the average listener, and that reality led to tensions between Henry and Schaeffer. By 1958, their philosophical differences had come to a head. According to NPR, Henry spoke about this divide in 1997. As time passed, Schaeffer reproached me with spending too much time on practical applications and not enough on research, but I was more interested in opening up musique concrète to wider audiences. We quarreled a great deal and he ended up firing me. But it wasn't such a bad thing because I founded my own studio. After this divide, even Schaeffer himself seemed to retreat from his concrète experiments. He founded a new collective, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, and dedicated more of his time to developing his philosophy and schooling the next generation of experimentalists. Over the next years, this GRM would help foster key figures in early electronic music, like Luc Ferrari and Bernard Parmigiani. 1958 also saw the founding of another key studio, the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. That workshop furthered many of the experiments of concrète and found practical applications for it as well. The work of Schaeffer and Henry became the foundation of sound palettes that the Radiophonic Workshop created for sci-fi shows like Doctor Who. That Radiophonic Workshop was yet another hotbed for early electronic music. One of the most important artists working out of it was Delia Derbyshire, who combined concrète influences with early electronic music to great effect. There's a good chance you've heard Derbyshire's work, as she was the mind behind the electronic arrangement of the original 1963 Doctor Who theme. While that theme is by no means an example of musique concrète, the techniques developed by the GRMC and the experimental approach preached by Schaeffer and Henry were huge influences on Derbyshire. And she wasn't the only one. By the mid-60s, a new ethos was emerging all over the art world. The psychedelic revolution had enraptured a generation of baby boomers who were just coming of age and looking for new modes to express their experience of a changing world. Mass media and pop culture were exploding on a scale that had never been seen before. The Cold War was heating up, and the threat of nuclear war hung over the heads of entire societies. And with the youth vastly outnumbering the old generation, it seemed as though the world were poised for a dramatic social and cultural upheaval. The initial soundtrack to this upheaval was rock and roll, a music built around rebellious boundary pushing. But as psychedelics hit the world, it became clear that rock was only scratching the surface of what was possible. And so a number of rock musicians looked to the avant-garde movements of a post-war Europe for inspiration. They combined the abstract experimentalism of movements like concrète with the more approachable pop sensibilities of rock and roll. The result was a new set of sounds that completely transformed the shape of popular music. One of the first rock artists to truly embrace the avant-garde was Frank Zappa. Zappa became interested in experimental music as a teenager, listening to Stravinsky and Varese just as eagerly as he listened to Johnny Guitar Watson and Howlin' Wolf. By his 20s, Zappa had become involved with an underground music scene sprouting up in Los Angeles. He found work composing for films and set up his own experimental sound studio called Studio Z. Like Studio to Say 20 years earlier, Zappa used Studio Z as a place to experiment with his own avant-garde recording techniques. These experiments would see the light of day in 1966, when Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention released their debut album, Freak Out. That album ends on a surreal 12-minute Varese-influenced sound collage called The Return of the Son of Monster Magnet. Zappa never actually completed the song like he imagined, but he ended up releasing it in its unfinished form. And even in that form, it stands as a clear example of musique concrète's influence on rock, with manic sound patterns weaving in and out over a steady drum beat. But unlike the cold, harsh soundscapes of some of the more intense concrete pieces, Zappa's usage has the effect of making the song feel like a zany, surreal party. This serves a clear purpose within the album, which parodises Los Angeles' freak scene. The Return of the Son of Monster Magnet seems like an expression of the comic surreality of that scene, and of mid-century America itself. Meanwhile, across the pond, the Beatles were also beginning to turn their eyes to the avant-garde. Throughout the spring of 1966, the Beatles were in the studio working on their 7th album, Revolver. The year before, John Lennon and George Harrison had been profoundly changed by a series of psychedelic experiences. They sought to create music that could capture the sensations of these experiences and share them with an audience. To do so, they looked to all kinds of sources: Indian classical music, the writings of Timothy Leary, and musique concrète. These influences coalesce most clearly on Tomorrow Never Knows, a psychedelic masterpiece that perfectly incorporates concrete with the Beatles' own pop rock sounds. The bed of that song is a collage of psychedelic tape loops, created by using sound manipulation techniques that Schaeffer and Henry had innovated with the GRMC. But rather than living in strange, inhuman soundscapes, these techniques are placed within a more familiar pop framework. The result is a song that perfectly captured the psychedelic experience and helped fuel the exploding psychedelic rock revolution. When putting the song together, Lennon had encouraged engineer Geoff Emerick to break the rules and ensure that each instrument should sound unlike itself, an approach that clearly echoes Schaeffer's philosophy of sound objects. And the dialogue between rock and roll and concrete wasn't just a one-way street. Just as rock musicians were realizing the potential of concrete, so too were avant-garde composers finding inspiration in rock and roll. In 1967, Pierre Henry teamed up with Michel Colombier and released a piece called Psych Rock, which was inspired in part by Wild Thing and Louie Louie. Like Tomorrow Never Knows, Psych Rock combines experimental sound collage with more traditional rock patterns to great effect. Psych rock became a favorite of electronic musicians for years to come, and would even inspire the Futurama theme song. By combining concrete with pop music, the experimentalists of the 60s were able to truly display the brilliance of their concepts to a wider audience. And as for the Beatles, Tomorrow Never Knows was just the start of their experimentations. Shades of concrete are seen all over Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and in 1967, the Beatles created their most avant-garde work to date, a piece called Carnival of Light. Paul McCartney created Carnival of Light for the Million Volt Light and Sound Rave, an experimental electronic music experience. That experience was hosted by Unit Delta Plus, a group that included Brian Hodgson and Delia Derbyshire from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, as well as synthesizer pioneer Peter Zinoviev. It was a 14-minute piece heavily inspired by McCartney's explorations into London's avant-garde scene, as well as his growing respect for Stockhausen. That performance was recorded, but Carnival of Light has never actually seen the light of day. And because of that, it's become a bit of a legend in Beatles lore. Pretty much everything we know about its sound comes secondhand from descriptions by those who experienced it live, and plenty of those descriptions liken it to the return of the son of Monster Magnet. While it was McCartney that introduced this kind of experiment to the Beatles, it would be Lennon, along with Yoko Ono and George Harrison, who were responsible for the avant-garde Beatles song that did see the light of day, Revolution 9.
Number 9.
Revolution 9 was originally born out of an extended abstract jam that ended Revolution 1. Lennon cut the end of the jam off and used it as a basis for a new piece, a piece that represented the furthest the Beatles would ever go into the experimental. Revolution 9 stripped the pop sensibilities that the Beatles had been laying over top of their concrete experiments, instead presenting the avant-garde open and naked in a way that feels closer to Stockhausen or Schaeffer than it does to basically anything else in the Beatles' catalog. And just like Schaeffer used concrete to comment on a post-war world that had seen meaning turned on its head, Lennon, Ono, and Harrison used Revolution 9 to comment on a tumultuous world that seemed to be careening toward revolution. In a 1970 interview with Rolling Stone, Lennon explained, "Revolution 9 was an unconscious picture of what I actually think will happen when it happens, just like a drawing of a revolution." When Lennon was creating the song in 1968, revolution certainly seemed to be in the air. Progressive thought leaders were being assassinated, the war in Vietnam was escalating, and counterculture movements around the world were erupting into sometimes violent protests. In May of 1968, student uprisings in France, the birthplace of the concrete, had the country teetering on the edge of revolution, so much so that Charles de Gaulle even fled the country. And there were plenty of musicians who were embracing this revolutionary spirit. But as radical as Lennon was, his take on revolution was much more nuanced, and I think that's represented in the music of Revolution 9. Because as necessary as it can be sometimes, revolution is a terrifying and unsettling experience. It is the complete breakdown of all societal norms, a descent into violence and chaos with no guarantees that what comes next will fix the core issues. Many of history's most famous revolutions have led to terrible regime shifts, bloody periods of instability, and complete breakdown of the social order. Revolution 9 is a sonic depiction of that. Just as Schaeffer's music questioned what a nuclear society truly deserved, I think Lennon's music is questioning if the people in the streets were actually ready for the chaos they claimed they wanted to sow. This reading is backed up by the fact that Revolution 1, which spawned the song in the first place, has a clear disdain for violent revolution, with Lennon singing that he will sit out any kind of destruction. And beyond any potential meaning to be found in the music of Revolution 9, the very act of including such a radical piece on a Beatles album stands as a powerful tribute to some of the most important experimentalists in music history. To this day, Revolution 9 might be the best known piece of true musique concrète ever recorded. And while these kinds of fully abstract sound collages didn't exactly catch on like many of the Beatles' other experiments, concrete continued to have a huge influence even beyond Revolution 9. In 1969, Schaeffer disciple Bernard Parmigiani created Pop Eclectic as part of a film score. Pop Eclectic combines concrete techniques with samples from contemporary acts like Small Faces and Pink Floyd to create an early example of the mashup and of the music that would one day be called Plunderphonics. And Pink Floyd themselves would experiment with concrete to great effect. In 1969, the band were still trying to figure out what their new identity would look like after the loss of their frontman Syd Barrett. That year, they released the most experimental album of their career, Ummagumma. Buried at the end of the third side of Ummagumma is an experiment in concrete, a 5-minute noise collage called Several Species of Small Furry Animals Gathered Together in a Cave and Grooving with a Pick. That piece was assembled by Roger Waters, who told the Carillon that it was a bit of concrete poetry. Waters' interest in concrete came from a Scottish composer named Ron Geeson. In 1967, as concrete and psychedelic pop were clashing, Geeson released a strange comic album called A Raise of Eyebrows. By 1970, Waters and Geeson had begun to collaborate. Geeson helped with the arrangement of Pink Floyd's Adam Hart Mother, and Waters and Geeson teamed up to create the soundtrack to The Body, a documentary film by Roy Battersby. That soundtrack combines light psychedelic folk with experimental concrete, using sounds made by the human body. One of the songs Geeson and Waters created for that soundtrack was Breathe, an early version of a track by the same name that would appear on Dark Side of the Moon 3 years later. And the influences of concrete are all over Dark Side of the Moon. The album opens on a dramatic, anxiety-inducing sound collage forecasting the sonic experiments that will define the rest of it. From the symphony of alarm clocks on time, to the cash register and coin tape loop that opens money, some of the most celebrated moments of Dark Side of the Moon are walking in the footsteps of Henry and Schaeffer. The same year that Pink Floyd released Dark Side of the Moon, krautrock pioneers Faust released another triumph of concrete, the Faust tapes. Like Dark Side of the Moon, the Faust tapes puts more traditional rock songs side by side with wild, experimental pieces of sound collage. The result is sometimes profound, sometimes frightening, often jarring, and thoroughly engaging from start to finish. By the 1970s, the original vision of Pierre Schaeffer's concrete had been stretched and reshaped, even as he continued to preach his own philosophies with the GRM. Concrete had melded itself with rock and electronic music, and consistently attracted the attention of the brightest and most experimental minds in music. And that's because Musique Concrète was one of the first movements to truly understand the potential that recording technology had to change music. In fact, all the way back in 1952, as Schaeffer was experimenting with the GRMC, he wrote a vision of the future of music technology. The coherence of this perspective leads us to cybernetic machines. Indeed, only machines of this type, probably weighing several tons and costing hundreds of millions, with oscillating circuits equipped with a certain memory, will permit endless play with complex numerical combinations, which are the key to all musical phenomena. While he was wrong on the size and price, what Schaeffer is describing there sounds an awful lot like a digital audio workstation, the heart of nearly all music produced today. The influence that Schaeffer and the GRMC had on the rise of electronic music cannot be understated. Many of the earliest pioneers in electronic worked with the GRMC, and the popular musicians they influenced would go on to define the genre in decades to come. From Kraftwerk's use of found sound on Autobahn, to Brian Eno's fondness for tape loops, all the way to Aphex Twin's chopped up and distorted samples, Musique Concrète looms large over the entire history of electronic music. And then, of course, there's the matter of hip-hop. While many of the pioneers of turntablism and sampling weren't explicitly influenced by Musique Concrète, the practices they developed on their own are echoes of the early sampling that Schaeffer and Henry developed. The techniques and technologies that formed the basis of Schaeffer's acousmatic music were reinvented as the building blocks for hip-hop. And that doesn't even get into the wild worlds of plunderphonics and sampledelia. You almost certainly don't get the Avalanches or Jay Dilla without the experimentation of a few crazy Frenchmen a half-century earlier. At the end of the day, a lot of Musique Concrète only appeals to people with very particular tastes, and frankly, I don't blame you if you were put off by listening to some of this stuff. But without these kind of radical experiments, without Schaeffer's philosophizing and Henry's turntable wizardry, without Stockhausen's tape manipulation, and yes, without John Lennon and Yoko Ono's avant-garde noodling, the music world would be a drastically different place today. For me, the ultimate lesson that came from Musique Concrète is the idea that in order to truly change music, we need to be willing to question everything we take for granted about it. We need to be willing to embrace the changes of the world around us and shed our attachments to the warm comfort of familiarity. Or, as Pierre Henry himself put it is necessary to destroy music. Musique Concrète is just one of a whole number of avant-garde musical movements that erupted in the wake of the Second World War. These movements sought to redefine what music could be and to explore new avenues of interaction between audience and listener. If you want to learn about another one of these avant-garde experimental movements, you should check out Volksgeist's video on danger music. To watch that video, you can head on over to Nebula. Nebula is the prestige streaming service that helps independent creators like myself spread our wings and make our wildest creative dreams a reality. It was Nebula that supported Polyphonic magazine, my homage to print media that remains some of my favorite work I've ever done to this day. And Nebula is continuing to grow, tapping into the brilliant ideas of creators to make everything from fiction originals to reality game shows to some of the best documentary content out there. Honestly, whatever sort of content you're into, I can almost guarantee Nebula has something for you. Personally, I loved The Ballad of John and Yoko, Lindsay Ellis's deep dive on the cultural treatment of John Lennon and Yoko Ono. Or, if you're looking for something lighter, you can always check out Jetlag the Game, Nebula's jet-setting series that turns the world into an elaborate board game. So why not check it out? If you head over to nebula.tv/polyphonic, you can get started today with 40% off an annual subscription. That means $36 a year, or just $3 a month, for a library of streaming content that rivals any other streamer out there, and it's all independently owned and developed by creators like myself. And if you find something you really like on Nebula and want to share it with someone you love, well, you're able to do that thanks to Nebula's new guest passes. Each month you're with Nebula, you'll get a guest pass to share some of our exclusive content with friends or family. These passes are an example of the kind of experimentation that I love about Nebula. They have no restrictions on what they can watch, and if Nebula sees that a lot of these are being used, they're going to look for more ways to hand out guest passes. So why not give it a shot? Again, you can check out nebula.tv/polyphonic for 40% off an annual premium subscription. Following that link gets you access to amazing content, and it does a ton to help support my channel. And hey, thanks for watching.